Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming this evening to tonight's lecture, which is titled Looking for Clues in the Rubble of Raqqa, How the Most Precise Air Campaign in History Left Raqqa the Most Destroyed City in Modern Times. Tonight's talk is part of our ongoing collaboration between the Architectural Association and Amnesty International, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce tonight's speakers, who will be talking about such an important topic, questioning whether destroying a city is a necessary act in order to liberate it, and who decides and on what basis, and how much destruction is necessary or acceptable. To understand the scale of devastation in Raqqa, I encourage you to visit the exhibition next door in the AA Gallery that rethinks the traditional written report and uses photographs, 3D reconstructions, and dashcam footage to show us the true extent of destruction by the US-led coalition. This reconstruction is crucial to understand what happened and utilizes a multidisciplinary methodology involving field investigations of strike sites and witness interviews, combined with remote sensing and a satellite imagery analysis project called Strike Tracker, which involved the participation of thousands of online volunteers to review over 130,000 frames of buildings throughout the battle. So to quickly introduce tonight's speakers, Donatella Rivera is Amnesty International Senior Crisis Response Advisor, and she led the Raqqa investigation. And Milena Marin is Amnesty International Senior Advisor from their Evidence Lab, who led the Strike Tracker project. And they'll tell us more about their work on the specific project in tonight's talk. And once they finish their presentation, we'll break out into a discussion that will be moderated by John Palmasino and Anne-Sophie Ronskog from Diploma Unit 4, and also who are co-founders of Territorial Agency. And I encourage you all to stick around. After the talk, we'll have some drinks to continue the conversation more informally and give you a chance to see the exhibition next door. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Donatella and Milena to the AA.
So is this working? It is, thank you. Raqqa, this is what happened. Raqqa is a medium-sized city in Syria in the northeast, about 300,000 inhabitants. And the US-led coalition that was made up of three countries, it was made up of 74 countries, but 3 countries that took part in the military operation in the summer of 2017, in an operation that lasted 4 months and 1 week. This much of Raqqa was destroyed. It's about 11,000 buildings that were destroyed or damaged. There are more buildings that were damaged than those that show up on the satellite imagery, because some of the buildings that were damaged by artillery don't show up on SAT. So the number of civilian casualties that we have that are reported are over 1,600. That is a conservative figures. Is really, we're only really looking at the number of cases that for which we have quite a lot of information. So this is what it looks today, but civilians live there in those buildings that look like a pile of rubble now. Now, this is some of the declarations that were made by coalition officials, notably the coalition commander, General Townsend. There has never been a more precise air campaign in the history of armed conflict. Contrast that declaration with this. And you can see immediately that it wasn't all that precise. At the same time, the same General Townsend said, "We shoot every boat we find. If you want to get out of Raqqa right now, you've got to build a poncho raft." There is really no pride to take in saying we shoot every boat we find, because at that time, the river was really the only way out of Raqqa, given that ISIS, that was controlling the city, had mined most exit routes, and the coalition had bombed the bridges, so people could only get out of Raqqa by taking boats across the river, and many were indeed killed by bombardments by the coalition. So something else that coalition officials said was that in 5 months, they, meaning his colleagues, the US Marines, because even though there were 3 countries that were participating, the overwhelming majority of the airstrikes were carried out by US forces, and 100% of the artillery strikes were carried out by US forces. In 5 months, they fired 30,000 artillery rounds, more than any other Marine artillery battalion or any Marine or Army battalion since the Vietnam War. Again, there is no pride to take in this because artillery is a battlefield weapon. It shouldn't be used in urban areas where there are civilians. And at the time, there were civilians in every neighborhood of Raqqa. The military base from where those launches were happening was about 16, 17 kilometers to the north of Raqqa. That's where the US Marines were firing into the city. To give you an idea of how inaccurate artillery is, every artillery shell has a margin of error of more than 100 meters. So this is what it is. If you fire an artillery shell, you can fire more or less within that. In a city where the difference of 10 meters will make the difference between a house full of civilians and a house full of ISIS fighters or a legitimate military target, 100 meters is a risk that is absolutely unacceptable. Even in war, not everything is allowed. I mean, I hear often, but, what could you do? They had to get rid of ISIS. Wasn't that a price worth paying? There are laws that must be respected in war. And the question really is, was all that could and should have been done by the coalition forces? Remembering that we are talking about countries that have the best equipped, most well-resourced armies in the world. So we set about investigating the impact of that devastating war on the civilian population. I first traveled to Raqqa during the war, but I was working from outside the city, speaking to people who were coming out of Raqqa, managing to escape, those who could. And then I went back immediately after the war at the beginning of 2018. One of the biggest challenges to do the field work, and that field work was done over 5 separate visits, spending several months altogether, during which I carried out field investigation at more than 200 sites of coalition strikes and interviewed more than 400 survivors and witnesses. One of the biggest challenges at the beginning was that there was no communication in Raqqa. There was no phone network, no internet. So the only way of finding people was walking up and down these streets and knocking on every door, looking for people. The other biggest and bigger still challenge was the fact that Raqqa was the most contaminated city in modern times, according to the deminers who were there, and the deminers from the UN and other demining organizations that were assessing the level of contamination, both by mines and improvised exploded devices, IDs, as well as those were laid by ISIS to prevent the population from leaving, to prevent the troops from coming in. The local fighters who were fighting against ISIS, and from unexploded ordnance that had been dropped by coalition forces. Those were all over, as you can see. This is one of the big MK bombs used by the coalition. They were kind of like all over in the streets. And then there were those that had been dropped by the coalition and repurposed by ISIS fighters and turned into IEDs. Normally, when I go to a place after a conflict, one of the first things I do is very much looking in the rubble, because munitions leave pieces, and often those pieces have serial numbers on. So it's very important to find those. In Raqqa, that was a challenge because the rubble was so heavily contaminated. I did do a bit of that to the extent that it was possible in places that had already been cleared, and so it was useful because it was finding pieces of munition that were telling us what we needed to corroborate the narrative of the witnesses. Testimonies are important, but testimonies can be 100% true, 100% false, and everything in between. So it's very important to corroborate them with material evidence. So one of the things that I did, because I couldn't dig too much in the rubble, was going around scrap yards, because people will take heavy pieces of metals that are of no use to scrapyard and sell them, because they obviously need the income. And so I found lots of artillery shells like this one, and I found pieces like this, which took several weeks and the analysis of many military experts to work out what it was. I knew it was something important because I found lots of them in the scrapyards. Then the question is, what happened? How did it happen? And when did it happen? So there were testimonies of people who told us about having been either sheltering in their own homes or in whatever place they could find, because a lot of people had been forced to leave their homes and because of the shifting front lines, and they were sheltering in other buildings, such as the building that you see in this photo, where 32 civilians from 4 different families were killed. Now, in putting together the material evidence from the building, what a building like this tells me that this could not have been an artillery strike, this was an airstrike. The testimonies of people who survived, there were only 3 survivors from this particular strike, testimonies of other people who lived around there, and then satellite imagery. And that is, Milena will talk more in details about the enormous amount of work that we did with satellite imagery. But for example, on a building like this, the 3 survivors, 2 adults and a child, one adult was so badly traumatized that she said, you know, I don't know the date. The child is a child, and he's 12, and he's never been to school, and he cannot read and write, and he doesn't do dates. And the man gave me a date, and I said, are you sure? And he said, yes, of course, how would I forget? I lost my wife and my children. The reality is that, especially in situation of conflict where people have gone through tremendous trauma, as well as events having happened at a time when they had other priorities than remembering the date, like trying to keep their kids safe. Often people remember the minutest detail, what time of the day it was, other stuff that was happening, but not necessarily the date. So here, the one person who thought he remembered the date was out by 5 weeks. And that's very common. So that's where analysis of satellite imagery is massively important. And then there was the work of the first responders team who have been exhuming the bodies and both taking bodies from the rubble, from the building sites where so much rubble came and buried the bodies that it could not be done by the relatives at the time. And as well as exhuming bodies that people had buried in gardens and parks around the city because they could no longer reach the cemetery, it was beyond the front line. So they also had their own records of how many bodies they pulled from which building site. And so from all of this, the conclusions that we draw are that the coalition did not do all that it could and should have done to spare civilians. They could have chosen different munitions. They should not have used artillery. And when it comes to air-delivered munition, they should have had better surveillance. We heard from the forces on the ground that sometimes airstrikes would come in within 10 or 15 minutes, or even less, of those airstrikes having been called, meaning that very little time and effort was being put in to verify the targets. Hence, not surprising that so many civilians were killed. The coalition until now has only admitted roughly 10% of the of the most conservative estimate that we have for the number of casualties. Even that 10% are for the majority cases that Amnesty International has submitted to them, and the others are cases that Air Wars, the organization with whom we also partnered for this investigation, submitted to them. So we NGOs have been doing the work that the coalition has not done. We did an initial smaller sample last year. We submitted it to the coalition. They criticized our work, said that our methodology is flawed and we don't understand the reality of war, but after 6 weeks they admitted all those casualties. We've now investigated a much, much greater number of cases, 641 to be precise. And so, on the one hand, the coalition will not be able to dismiss that as being isolated cases, a few individual incidents, and on the other hand, this has shown that it is possible to carry out those investigations in Raqqa at the moment. It's not always the case that it's possible to do so in a post-war theater. It is possible in Raqqa, and the coalition should do so. It should do so for 3 reasons, essentially. One is because it should be interested in learning from the mistakes of Raqqa so that the same mistakes are not repeated in another conflict. It should do so as a basis to provide reparation to the families of those who were killed and to those who, like this little girl, was left maimed. She lost her mother and 3 sisters, and she herself lost a leg. And it should do so as a basis to help people who've lost their homes and their businesses, as well as other places such as the school, which are still in a state as you see, and to help the families who've lost their homes and livelihoods so that their kids can go to school instead of being forced to go scavenging to help feed the family. So I'll stop here and hand over to Milena, who'll talk about the more remote aspect of the investigation.
Thank you, Donatella. Can you hear me? Yeah. So as Donatella said, I haven't been on the ground, but I was part of a team of open source investigators or remote investigators supporting from the office, from London. So what we did, we wanted to go beyond what is possible, humanly possible by a single person. So Donatella is a superhuman, but even she can't do absolutely everything. So we needed really all hands on deck to provide that scale that would really make the coalition go from saying, even when they did acknowledge cases of civilian casualties, they kept saying that is an isolated case. We wanted to demonstrate that it's a pattern and that it happened throughout the battle, throughout the city. So really to do that, we needed to achieve a scale that, again, was not possible from even a person, definitely not a team. We needed much more than that. One thing that we wanted to analyze at scale was satellite imagery, precisely to be able to corroborate the time of testimonies, but also to understand the scale of destruction, to understand the mechanisms of the war and the timeline of the war. To do that, we have been using a technology called microtasking. So this is a type of crowdsourcing, and I'll show you in a minute how it works. We have a platform called Amnesty Decoders, where we use this kind of technology to scale up research, to support investigators that go on the field with really the power of the numbers and the data. So microtasking is taking a large task, like in this case, a satellite image, splitting it into small or micro tasks and distribute these small tasks over the internet to many, many people. So as I said, it's a type of crowdsourcing that helps you analyze data that you already have. So you may know crowdsourcing as soliciting information, but this is when we already have the information. The information is way too much for us to analyze. The satellite image has thousands of buildings, and we can't look at every single building ourselves to identify when it was destroyed. So that's why we appeal to the crowd. We have been using this technology for a while now. This is the first time we're looking at timeline of satellite images, but before we have analyzed when villages in Darfur were burned down. We analyzed online violence against women on Twitter. We looked at oil spills in the Niger Delta. So we have an established methodology to engage members of the public to really work with us very deeply on research. So instead of maybe signing a petition online, now they have the ability to really be part of our research team and help us generate useful data. So I talked a little bit about these past projects. So in the context of Raqqa, we launched a project called Strike Tracker that was aiming to track every single building in Raqqa that was destroyed to determine when it was destroyed. And that was a part of the multi-layer investigation that resulted in the work we're presenting today. We also had a team of students, trained students that scoured the internet to find any video related to Raqqa and geolocated. We partnered with Air Wars that collected in real time any social media reports, and again that was corroborated. So the Strike Tracker is a part of it. So what people did who participated in Strike Tracker, they looked at a timeline of satellite images. So that's an animation of how it worked. They were looking at a specific building and had to scroll through a timeline of images to find when that building was destroyed, and they had to mark before and after destruction. So although you may think that working on Raqqa or working on satellite images requires expertise, we made sure that this project was so simple for anybody to use that you really didn't require much expertise. You required a device that had access to internet. You required some patience and willingness to learn. We gave people a tutorial as they started, so in 10 minutes they were up and running and able to analyze satellite images at scale. We had over 3,000 people from around the world doing this task. Together, they analyzed over 2 million image chips. They contributed the equivalent of over 1 year of work. So just to give you a sense of what happened with that data, so we were able to map the mechanisms of destruction of the city. We could see how it was taken from outside to the inside. I'll let this play once again. You can see from the beginning. So we used this data, as I said, to understand how the war unfolded, but also to corroborate those testimonies. We mapped 11,000 buildings that were destroyed, and of course, not in every single building we could find allegations of civilian casualties. We have mapped all the cases where we did find civilian casualties. So you can see in black, you have cases that have been verified, mostly with field investigations. And the gray ones are cases that we haven't yet managed to corroborate 100%, but they have very credible reports from social media, reports that have more than one person or one organization's reporting from the ground. This has been done in collaboration with our colleagues from Air Wars and Syrian Archive. So these cases here, you have on the map over 350 cases. And in total, Donatella has said already that we estimate 1,600 victims, out of which we have names for 1,028. And here are a screenshot of the platform that you can see in the exhibition. Out of 1,028 named victims, we have 280 named children. Out of the named children, these are 0 to 17, 50 are under 2-year-olds. So really, this is a testimony of what happened. We managed to not just collect all the data, but also show it in a compelling way. So in the exhibition, you can see really the mix, and I think it's not happening very often, even in Amnesty, but even outside Amnesty, to have that combination of field investigation with remote analysis and with presentation that is really compelling. We use 360 stories. You have VR headsets in the exhibition. We use dashcam footage. And really what we want to do is show people the stories of the victims in Raqqa and hopefully to take action. We still want to pressure the coalition to change that. As Donatella said, we want them to acknowledge the casualties and provide reparations to people on the ground. So if you guys have a chance, please visit the platform and also take action. Help us build that pressure to help the coalition change.
Good. We've been very disciplined. We've tried to be sharp and short, so we're at your disposal for questions.
Donatella and Milena, this is, first of all, thank you. I think that from the entire Architectural Association, thank you for bringing this work here, because obviously this is a school that is preoccupied with building, and you're showing us how destruction is a part and parcel of that practice. And we had previously we were discussing how many of these children actually were killed by the buildings falling on them, and so it was the architecture killing many of these children and their families. And two questions. The first one has to do with that slide that you had up, Donatella, where you said no communication in Raqqa. And it is very striking to see that the most looked at city at that moment from outside had no communication inside. Do you think that bringing your work back to the city will somehow help a new form of communication in view of a possible reconstruction, or also even mourning condition? That is the first question. So a question about mourning and what kind of communication. But the second one is really for Milena. The disparity, it seems to me, about visibility is very similar in my mind to that we have in contemporary discussions about climate change, where we have a lot of information. It's under our all eyes, but we don't act. It's not that this is something that happened behind the scenes. It happened on live television. But still, it has to be the work of Amnesty to come back to, say, the other cities and say, look what has happened in that moment when you were not completely paying attention. So the question is whether your work on crowdsourcing could be, in your mind, anticipated. Not only in the aftermath of such a destruction, but somehow during crisis, or even to prevent crisis.
So, your first question on communication. I mean, now there is some communication in Raqqa. There is a little bit, I mean, the phone picks up here and there in some places. This is very recent, and there are internet cafes that function around the city. They are satellites, so people can go by and check their messages. It's not strong enough to have voice calls, but it's possible to have WhatsApp messages and stuff. So in that respect, now it's improved. Now, what we plan to do, the platform is being translated, so it will be available in Arabic, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And it's specifically aimed so that people in Raqqa who want to send additional information or new information, they can do so, because the idea is, for example, for many of the victims, we don't have photographs. In some cases, you know, we've checked with the families. They don't have them because everything was destroyed. But so, yeah, the idea is to sort of give back some ownership to people of Raqqa in a way also with this. Also, I think it's important to explain why there was little, as it was happening, little information that was coming out. And that is, whereas the rest of Syria has been, in a way, it's been dubbed the YouTube war, because things happen and they're up on YouTube within 10 minutes. Raqqa was very much an exception because ISIS did not allow people to use their mobile phone. There was hardly any internet, and if anybody was caught filming stuff or taking photos and sending out, they risked being killed. So the amount of information that was available before the war and during the war was very little because of that. And then for a long period, because everything was destroyed, and it was nobody's priority, including the coalition, because you can put a mast up and presto, you can restore communication pretty quickly. So it took a long time. It took essentially a year before people started to have internet and so on. So it was clearly not considered a priority. But
so just very quickly on the issue of visibility. My friend Jonathan Gray, who's a lecturer at the King's College University, he studied the Decoders program and the whole crowdsourcing initiative we have and the way we involve people in analyzing evidence of human rights violations. And he coined this term data witnessing. So it's a form of witnessing remotely through data. So that's what we're asking people from around the world. By giving their time participating in this project, they are somehow witnesses to the atrocities, and they help us process and understand the information. Of course, we're doing that post-war. So we are analyzing the satellite images once the conflict is over. Donatella has been there during the war, and very often now at Amnesty, with the crisis response team that is newly established at Amnesty, we're quicker to get in the field. But the evidence is still, especially satellite images, we very often can access them only afterwards. But I want to say is that the availability of satellite images changed dramatically in the past 10 years. Donatella is the one to say that 10 years ago, this kind of analysis would have been impossible because there were no images. And if there was, maybe there was one single image over the city during the whole war. Now we have companies that image the world, every single place on Earth, every day. So that means that the temporal resolution has increased dramatically. The spatial resolution, so the extent to which we can distinguish features on the ground, is still lagging for those images that have very high temporal resolution. So the images that are available every day are at a resolution that is 15 meters per pixel. So that means in every pixel on the satellite image, we see 15 meters on the ground. The highest resolution available right now is 30 centimeters per pixel, so that, again, for every pixel in the image, we see 30 centimeters on the ground, which is the distance between our shoulders. I don't know that we'll have anytime soon much higher spatial resolution because that will have huge implications in privacy, at least not commercially available. We know that there's technical capability to take better images, but they won't be available for us. But all that to say that it changed dramatically in the past 10 years. It will change going forward. There's so many satellite imagery companies now that are emerging. It's not anymore the domain of the two giants, Airbus and Digital Globe. Now we have companies like Planet and all sorts of other small startups that are really making satellite images available. And then it will become an issue on how fast we can process the data. And again, there's an escalation of technology. We are using a combination of crowdsourcing, and also we're experimenting with artificial intelligence, so ways to train algorithms to detect these things automatically and maybe supported by people. So hopefully we'll get sometimes there where we can see these things happening in real time, but we're not 100% there yet. And the best we can do now is engage thousands of people and do it really quickly. We couldn't do that before. We could not have done an analysis of an entire city, 11,000 buildings, 2 million satellite images in a few weeks. Now we can.
I just wanted to add on exactly what changed. Somebody who's here in the audience is a former colleague 10 years ago exactly when the war in Gaza happened, and when there was incredible destruction in Gaza. there was no satellite imagery available. There was, but it was locked. We couldn't buy it. So there was one available, and it was the UNOSAT, and you know, it was from that angle on that day, and there was nothing else. How much things have changed in 10 years. There are now many more companies, they want to sell their stuff, and so the number of places at what time it's locked, it's much easier to obtain. And who knows, maybe, I don't know, 10 years down the line, we'll have our own satellite. It's now also much, much cheaper. I mean, I remember even just sort of 4 or 5 years ago, often I had to beg for satellite images, like, you know, you can have one, but not two. Because it was much more expensive. Now it's a lot cheaper. I mean, satellite imagery doesn't solve everything. Being able to go to the ground and do the field investigation is crucial, but satellite imagery doesn't lie, and you can prove things that before people would say yes, but maybe not, but you know, who says that, and it happened before, or it's now, the availability of satellite imagery allows us to say, well, no, that doesn't lie. And also, again, volunteers did an enormous amount of tasks, and then for those tasks where we needed to verify, we have trained analysts who, but we had that first swoop that allowed us to scale up the project.
One last question before we pass to the floor. The bombing was done with the help, so to say, of very complex technology, both visioning technology and targeting technology. To the extent that one could easily imagine that this is highly robotized bombing of Raqqa. To what extent do you think that the experience that you had on the ground in Raqqa is one not of the somehow insertion of technology as a possibility of limiting collateral effects of war, but one of augmentation of the collateral effects? Do you think that given your enormous experience in this kind of scenarios, is there something that is changing there? Because that's the general narrative, that computers would allow us to make better decisions at war. It seems that what you're showing us here is the opposite.
Yes and no. Basically what happened in Raqqa, which is what happens way too often in conflict, is that there are much more sophisticated weapons than those that were used for the most part in Raqqa. What was used mostly in Raqqa was cheap old stuff, which is what I find in most conflicts. Artillery is very cheap, but it costs a lot in human life because it goes and it takes out whatever in an area. So it shouldn't be used in cities. It too often is. It was used massively, more than anywhere else in Raqqa. And the result is what we saw. When it came to air-delivered munitions, again, those are precise, but precision munitions are only as precise as your intelligence. And it is possible these days, and for some time already, to strike a target, a legitimate military target, even moving, a guy on a motorbike going fast, without causing very much collateral damage at all. I mean, I've seen cases where, the driver is struck, the people sitting in the back seat of the car are not hurt. Those munitions are more expensive and they are more labor intensive, because if you want to take out this, you've got to use a munition that is expensive, that's very high precision, and you've got to put your manpower or woman power to kind of hone in on that target precisely, and maybe it moves so at the right time. If you want to do what they have done in Raqqa for the most part, you just say, I'll take out the whole building. And that's why...
Are you saying that...
That's why you have... that's why you have this.
Are you saying that part of the
So, sorry,
results...
just to finish. For the most part, I mean, I've seen from the stuff that I've collected in Raqqa, they also used smaller impact radius munition, Hellfire and other stuff, but mostly it was just great big MK family bomb, which are vintage in terms of what's available, and they are much cheaper. And, you know, not much to worry about. You just take out entire buildings. And, but then again, the cost is high. So the technology that is available was certainly not used very much in Raqqa. If it had, combined with the resources, time, and man and woman power to observe the targets and to verify the target, they could have spared many, many lives. You can never have a war without casualties. I mean, I wish there could, but I haven't come across one yet. But there was a lot of reckless, bombardments in Raqqa.
Are there questions from the floor?
I have to step out in about less than 10 minutes, so ask me the question, and then when I go, Milena will respond to questions about her, and maybe I'll take 2 or 3 at a time.
Okay. I was wondering, can you see this project not only kind of finding accountability for Raqqa itself, but also, in a way, with the proving that we are observing through satellite imagery and observing these cases all the time? It's also possibly a preventative measure to show that, you know, if you do commit some sort of war crimes or whatever in this case, will this kind of, you know, be something that then would be in the minds of these military people making the decisions in a way, but yeah.
Shall I take another couple?
We work together, just to clarify, and now I work on discourse analysis. And frankly, now I'm working on testimonies and how they are used politically. So I have a couple of questions on testimonies. And I know we're here with architects who don't analyze so much language. So this is maybe why I'm asking, is that why there aren't that many testimonies in this presentation? But also, with regards to all of this, the way the research is done now, what is the future for witness testimonies? What is its legal role in the analysis, if any? And if not, then why are witness testimonies collected?
Okay, so prevention, yes. I mean, the idea is that all our work is always aimed at, you know, the idea is that the perpetrators, and especially the perpetrators who say that they don't want to perpetrate human rights, that they want to respect human rights, is that they should learn from what's gone wrong. Because obviously if 1,600 people were killed in 4 months in what was supposed to be the most precise air campaign ever waged in history, that means that something has gone wrong. If entire buildings were taken out with 30 people, 20 people, 25 people in, something's gone wrong. So we very much hope that by putting this very detailed information, this is strong evidence that they will take note and learn and not repeat the same practices, especially that it is perfectly possible to avoid such recklessness. The material is there, the methodology is what was problematic. And certainly the fact that, if we look specifically at satellite imagery, satellite imagery, as I said, doesn't lie, and therefore, you know, the coalition may come back and say many things, but one thing that it cannot say is those buildings were not destroyed during our military operation. There was nobody else who had airplanes, so there was only them who had air power. Anything that was destroyed by air power is them, and the satellite imagery is there to show. Can that act as a deterrent? We certainly very much hope so. Testimonies. If you go to the platform, every single case that we investigated has testimony. Testimony is crucial. As I said, testimonies can be 100% true, 100% false, and everything in between. So a testimony by itself is what it is, a testimony. A testimony that is corroborated with other testimonies of other people who had nothing to do with it, that is corroborated by pieces of munitions, by the battle damage assessment that tells us that yes, people said it was an artillery or an airstrike, and indeed it is, because we can see from the pattern of destruction. And this or that munition, because we find pieces of it, and all of that, and the satellite imagery that corroborates that yes, it did happen when people said it happened. So, as always, it's the combination of the two. A testimony on its own is a testimony and can be interpreted and disputed and discussed forever after. A testimony with material evidence acquires a different kind of strength. The material evidence without any testimony is also insufficient, because I know that the building was bombed, I find a piece of munition, but I have no idea as to, you know, what happened there. So you really need the two, and that's why I think you already know, you don't know that I don't like working from a distance, investigating a situation where I cannot go and do the field investigation. But the best investigation is one where you combine the field with the remote. And it's not always possible, either because we have no access to the field, or because we have access to the field and you know, it's about something that happened on a particular day, and the satellite imagery doesn't help us because it was cloudy and it's, you know, you can't see, or it wasn't available. But when you manage to have both together, the remote and the field, is where you have the best chance of having a very solid findings.
Another question?
Sorry, this is a bit of a repeat, but I'm just curious, one thing was said about...
Excuse me, I have an interview that I couldn't postpone, but I'll be back in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.
I can take questions.
That's okay. Yeah, just to say, to Parrot John as well, just a lot of respect for the amount of work that's gone into this. But I'm just curious about what was said earlier about within war, there are laws to be respected, and obviously Amnesty's work's been going on for a long, long time. And when you look at what, not just this situation, but the situations that are going on right across the Middle East and further at the moment, do you think that is the case? Has it got any better with the work that's been done? Can you see it getting any better?
Well, I don't know that we can see it going any better, and it's the dilemma of human rights work, right? We think that every time we work on a conflict, it must be a deterrent for the next conflict, but that doesn't necessarily translate into evidence. So the fact that we worked on genocides in the past didn't necessarily stop the Rohingya massacre in Myanmar just a few months ago. What we can do is really be there very early on in the conflict and start showing the world what's happening. I think there's still a need for human rights investigations and organizations to go there and show the evidence and galvanize international advocacy, put pressure on international organizations, on states to intervene early on. But yeah, unfortunately, we've seen that the fact that we worked and documented conflicts in the past was no deterrent for human rights abuses or abuses to happen really at scale. But really the best we can do is put this evidence out there as early on as possible. Now, obviously, we're talking about a conflict that happened 2 years ago, and it took us this much time to get here. But as we're developing these methodologies, and don't forget that these are really new methodologies. We didn't have satellite images at all 10 years ago. We didn't have the technology we have right now even 2 years ago. So Amnesty as an organization is really scaling up in learning how to use technology, in learning how to involve thousands of people around the world, in learning how to use algorithms to do this work much quicker. And we can only hope that by being there quickly and by putting all the evidence out there, you know, as a war is unfolding, as a conflict is unfolding, we can change things as they happen. And of course, it's our ability to engage and really have millions behind us, because states won't listen to just Amnesty International, but they will listen when we have millions of people behind us, and then our ability to do international advocacy based on the evidence we show here.
So, I think that was the last question. No, you have another?
I can just say about the Gaza war. So when we did the investigation, there was a Gaza Operation Cast led 2008 to 2009, and then there was a massive outcry, and the result was that the next major conflict in Gaza was 2014. That was the achievement. That the wars in Gaza had been every 2 years prior to that outcry. So, result.
5 years on.
There was a break in the relentless kind of destruction in Gaza, slightly extended, on previous. So, it's an ongoing project, right? You can't relax. You just have to keep up the pressure.
Mm.
It's more of an observation than a question, but I fully understand and approve of the objective of the study in terms of the accountability of the bombing in which this country participated. But I think it would be more effective if there was just a couple of lines about the fact that the war had been going on and there was considerable destruction and civilian loss in Raqqa prior to the 2017 campaign. So it's just really an observation. I think it would be slightly more effective, particularly in fora like in the AA where, it's not somewhere that maybe everyone knows what happened in the war. So I just think it would be more effective if there was a few lines about the nature of both physical destruction and civilian losses in the several rounds of fighting prior to the aerial bombardment.
I can give a brief background to why we focused on June to October 2017. So before that, Raqqa was declared the capital of ISIS, and it has been so for a couple of years. There were indeed fightings inside Raqqa, and ISIS was targeted. But what we've seen from June to October was a completely deliberate campaign that included bombing over 11,000 buildings. So we looked at satellite imagery and we could see indeed destruction here and there, and it was like your normal level of destruction in conflict, but it's absolutely nothing compared to what we've seen between June and October. So the international coalition led by the US, there was UK and France were major partners in the coalition, but also 30 other countries, got together and decided to root ISIS out of the city. And the only way they saw to do that was to bombard entirely the city and destroy at least 11,000 buildings. At the end of the war, ISIS was given a free passage out of the city that wasn't afforded to civilians that were trapped during the war in the city because all the escapes were... So we chose this period and we focused on this period because it was the most intense destruction. I think you're right, maybe we're missing a little bit of the background and how we got here. But really, it was, we could have looked a year back, but really that's when everything unfolded, and that's when we could see the mass civilian casualties, that we could see mass destruction and so on.
I was just wondering about the claim of the most precise airstrike, because from what Donatella had explained, which I realized I should have been asking her this question instead, was that all the weaponry was vintage. So how could they even begin to make that claim in the first place? Why was that even said? Because it's completely false.
That's what we're trying to show with this project. We're trying to show there's a huge gap between the rhetoric and what the coalition has been saying during the war and the reality that we uncovered through this complex investigation in the field using remote analysis and so on. So they can go about and say whatever they want. It doesn't have to be true, and we know what era we live in, right? People don't say true stuff. So it's really our job to hold them to their words and to check every single thing they say and check that against reality. So the whole work and the whole platform, we called it rhetoric versus reality because we could see how their words just don't match up to what we found. And it's important for us to use their own rhetoric and really turn it around and show what really happened.
I just want to follow, just with a comment. Sorry, but it just, it seems that with the kind of condition of no communication was something that they were relying on, no? That they could just do this and no one was able to report it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Donatella mentioned in her presentation that we went there. We also gathered all the social media reports. The coalition kept consistently saying that all our claims are not credible without ever having set foot on the ground. They have not been there, or if they have been there, they have not been talking to witnesses. So really, yeah, they were relying on nobody questioning what they are saying. But of course, we're here to question every single word they are saying and to put the reality in front of them.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question's about the UK government specifically, given it's implicated in this coalition. And how has their response been to your work, and how is the communication between the government, Amnesty and the government in general, with regards to this specifically, but also in general when it comes to war crimes that the UK is implicated? So
we've been in touch with most members of the coalition, in particular US, UK, and France. US has led most of the bombardments in Raqqa. 100% of the artillery strikes and about 80 to 90% of the air-delivered munitions. They have changed their narrative as we confronted them. So at the very end of the war, they said nearly no casualties. And as we put out reports, they started slowly acknowledging here and there one case or the other. In total, until now, they acknowledge 159 casualties out of 1,600 that we estimate, so that's 10%. And they have, as I said, slowly, every month, they put out a casualty report with the reports they assess and the ones that they deem credible and the ones that they deem not credible. So we've been able to move them a little bit, and they have a certain level of transparency, which is nowhere nearly what we want them to have, but like a little bit. The UK instead is completely non-transparent. They have, I think they said that across Syria, since the beginning of the war, they had 1 civilian casualty. So I leave it at that because I don't know what else to say other than how can that be possible? You know, that in all the military campaign they've been involved in Syria with all the weapons they dropped, 1 single civilian casualty. So there's no transparency, there's no accountability, there's no response.
I have a question. My question is, if there are more than 30 countries intervening, why were there such old type of weaponry used? And if that's the case, who's paying for those weapons? And why is that methodology being used? I mean, certainly they could have used something a lot better if there are 30 countries intervening to get rid of ISIS.
Okay, can we get another one?
I've understood that some people have blamed the outbreak or the intensification of the war in Syria partially due to a series of droughts in northeastern Syria. I wonder in the future of Amnesty and their use of remote sensing, could you see that intensification of sort of climate-related situations that could cause conflict could be of interest in terms of prediction or witnessing what was happening?
Absolutely. So just answering your question first, yes, the coalition is a massive international coalition of states fighting ISIS in Syria. They are about to wind down now. You know, you've all heard that Trump declared victory in Syria. They defeated ISIS. No more need for the coalition. So they are starting to wind down. I mean, we'll see what happens in the future. I don't think it's a problem of having resources. Of course, all the states put together, in particular the US, you know, they are not poor state and they invest a lot in military capability. How they choose to spend those money, we have no insight into that. You know, how they choose how much money to allocate to a war in a very densely populated environment like Syria, and how they prioritize munitions over civilians or people on the ground versus civilians and so on. So that's really not something we have insight in. We can just see what's happened and we can put the evidence in front of them and ask those questions. And we are asking those questions, but they haven't answered yet.
Because it just seems a bit striking that 30 countries would work together to try and get rid of a small group such as ISIS. but at the same time have so many procedures like the UN, you know, the Syrian government, and everybody else with so much intel and so many drones, and it's just surprising that they would use such a methodology to just whisk away so many people just for the sake of releasing a group that doesn't necessarily have so much power and doesn't even want to have power in a place that won't be useful to them, such as Raqqa.
Yeah, as I said, it's really hard for us. It's all military tactics, and how these decisions are taken, even that it's not transparent. And if you ever want to ask a state how they take military decision, they will tell you it's top secret, and they will not reveal this kind of information. But, you know, it's as I said, we can analyze what happened. We cannot analyze how those decisions were taken just because we don't have any access into it. But yeah, that's the conclusion. It's absurd, and they should have done massively different. Going to the change into how Amnesty will work at the intersection of climate and climate-related conflicts, we are starting to do that in our team. So as I said, Donatella and I are part of the crisis response team at Amnesty International. So we have a combination of researchers, such as Donatella. They deploy onto the ground very quickly. Donatella can travel at a minute's notice. I think she has a bag all packed, and if you ask her to go into Syria tomorrow, I bet you she's ready to go. And we have 7 researchers like her that deploy to the ground. They are not specialized on any particular region or thematic area, but now we're starting to have some thematic focuses. One of the thematic focuses are old people in war and conflict. We're trying to understand what happens to the elderly in conflict. And another big thematic area is climate-related conflict. We have put out one of the first reports, but we're expanding that capability into the team to try to understand that link. We also have at Amnesty a new Secretary General. His name is Kumi Naidoo, and he comes from Greenpeace. So he comes with this huge kind of climate agenda and interest, and that means as well the organization is changing and shifting a little bit towards that. And of course, is the topic of the day now, how climate change impacts anything, and of course, conflicts are related to climate change.
Are there more questions? And then one last question, Milena, which is if I may so, a personal question, and that is, how do you feel in presenting your work in London about a conflict that was mainly aimed at ISIS, as if it would be in Syria, but it's actually a group of Londoners in Raqqa? How do you feel about that? How do you think that your work is responded to by populations in London that have been recently radicalized?
Well, that's a tough question. I'm wondering if anybody like that would come to the exhibition. So on Saturday, we had somebody who fought in Syria coming to the exhibition, a soldier that was fighting with the Syrian Defense Forces, that were the forces on the ground, Kurdish-led forces, supported by bombardments by the USA. So these were the guys calling in the bombardments. They were on the ground fighting ISIS. ISIS was around the corner. They would call and say, drop a bomb over this building. And it was interesting to have him there and hear his perspective from the ground. Of course, we disagreed on military tactics. But I don't know if somebody that was radicalized fighting on the other side, on the ISIS side, would ever be interested in something like this, because of course civilians were not their priorities. And you know, we're targeting this whole piece of work at the US coalition because we would expect them to act differently, and we would expect them to have accountability. I don't know that we can ever call accountability for ISIS because, yeah, they are not a state, there's no accountability measures, So I think we are presenting the work, of course, here in London to start with. We have sections around the world that are interested in picking up the exhibition and taking it around the world. And also we have the platform online that is available anywhere around the world. So while there's a local component and we're here with you talking today, we're hoping to impact audiences globally. And we're going to monitor the audiences, and I tell you if I can see anything related to radicalized folks.
Please join me in thanking Milena and, of course, Donatella.
Before we all go and have drinks in the adjoining room, I just wanted to remind you that the next talk is on the 8th of May, and we'll look at the destruction and reconstruction in Syria, and there'll be 2 Syrian architects here to talk with us. And then on the 29th of May, there's another talk about herbicide in Syria as part of this program. And the final event is on the 8th of June, which will be a training workshop looking at some of the techniques Amnesty uses. And you have to sign up for that by emailing Milena. So please stick around and do talk to Milena and Donatella, who'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.